After months of stopping short, Congressman Seth Moulton is now calling for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, joining 4 other Massachusetts representatives and both of the state's senators in calling for a halt to the war in Gaza, where more than 30,000 people have been killed since October. In a statement, Moulton called Hamas a terrorist organization. He also condemned Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's, quote, brutalist waging of the war, writing, "The ceasefire deal is our best hope to avoid more death." And Congressman Moulton joins me now. Thank you for being here. I want to ask you, before we get to the ceasefire and the situation in Gaza, you just wrapped up voting, along with your House colleagues, on $1.2 trillion in spending bills that are going to keep the government up and running. One of our producers handed me an article about that vote in which some Republicans were already crying out that this was a betrayal by House Speaker Mike Johnson. Is this vote, or are these votes to keep the government up and running, going to imperil his speakership?
Well, one of the craziest Republicans already filed a motion to vacate, to set in process the maneuver that ultimately cost Kevin McCarthy his job as the last speaker. So it is a legitimate threat. Now, I think the vast majority of Republicans don't want to see continued chaos in the House. Remember, we went 3 weeks this past fall without a speaker, the first time in American history that has happened. That's on the shoulders of House Republicans. They're the ones who made that happen. They're the ones who have shown they can't even manage the House of Representatives. I don't think they want to prove that again.
And this would be Marjorie Taylor Greene, correct? I heard this from you before we started rolling.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so you, just to be clear, you don't think that the lion's share of Republicans are going to be inclined to go along with her proposal?
That's correct. Now, the question, of course, is how many, right? Because if it's just one Republican, just Ms. Taylor Greene, then it's not going to be an issue. If it's a handful of Republicans, because their margin in the House is so small, it could be a real problem should Democrats also, as we usually do, vote against a Republican speaker. So there will be a lot of uncertainty when we come back to Washington next time.
Let's talk about your call for a bilateral ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. You have, from the outset of this conflict, starting with the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel, you have emphasized Israel's right to defend itself, but you've also voiced concern for a while about Israel's prosecution of the war if they know what approach they want to take, if that approach may be counterproductive as opposed to beneficial. Why are you calling for a bilateral ceasefire right now?
Well, let me be clear. A bilateral ceasefire means a hostage deal. It's the deal that's on the table that Israel has been trying to negotiate with Hamas. And currently Hamas, not Israel, is putting up the roadblocks to that deal. We want to see the hostages returned. They've been captured for 166 days since October 7th. And the ceasefire is what Israel is willing to give in return for doing so. This is quite distinct from people on the far left who are calling for a unilateral ceasefire, just stopping the war, stop trying to get rid of Hamas, and do nothing to get the hostages back. I'm certainly not calling for that.
So just to be clear, you want this to be immediate, you want it to be bilateral, you want an exchange of hostages to take place. It sounds like you don't want it to be indefinite, correct?
Well, look, it should be part of a deal. But at the end of the day, I support getting rid of Hamas. And frankly, that's not only good for Israel, it's ultimately good for the Palestinians as well. There's no peace in the Middle East as long as you have a terrorist organization that uses fellow Palestinians as human shields, a terrorist organization that has the eradication of the state of Israel written into its charter. There will never be peace as long as Hamas is in power.
But you also, in your statement, had very harsh words for Prime Minister Netanyahu. We mentioned at the outset that you called his prosecution of the war brutalist. My sense from your statement is that you see the war and the way it's being waged right now as running completely contrary to Israel's own self-interest and also as being waged in a fundamentally inhumane manner. Am I right about that?
That's exactly right, Adam. There are massive humanitarian concerns that we can all acknowledge. But my point about how the war is being carried out is that Netanyahu is not winning this war. it is counter to Israel's interests if the way he is attacking this problem ultimately makes it worse. And what we've seen in the latest data that's coming out of Gaza is that support for Hamas is rising. There's a lot of evidence that recruiting has been good for Hamas, that they're actually getting more adherence to the cause than Israel is taking off the battlefield. And of course, throughout the Middle East, a lot of nations, including nations that have been previously working closely with Israel, are turning against Israel because of the way Netanyahu is carrying out this conflict. And that is despite the fact that everyone agrees, at least in leadership in the Middle East, that Hamas needs to go. So it should be easy for Israel to get support for this mission to eradicate Hamas. And instead, because of the way Prime Minister Netanyahu is carrying out this war, it's not going well. He's basically just completely ignoring every lesson that we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's a huge mistake.
I'd like to know if you think that the Biden administration could be doing more to pressure Netanyahu to alter his approach. And before you answer, I just want to read a little bit of a Washington Post article that looked at the Biden administration's strategy when it came to engaging and shaping, engaging the Netanyahu government and shaping the conduct of the war. The Post wrote, Biden's strategy from the outset rested on a central trade-off, that if he showed Israel unequivocal, even defiant support early on, he could ultimately influence its conduct of the war. Some administration officials now concede the strategy is heading toward failure, and in private talks, they voice a striking frustration and uncertainty about how the war will end. Do you think that the Biden administration has failed to do as much as it could?
Well, I think the strategy made sense, and I think that it's the right thing to do when your ally is attacked. You stand by a democratic ally like Israel, and you support them, as we always have and will continue to do. And it's also correct that you should try to, help them learn from our lessons and our mistakes, the mistakes that we have made ourselves in the Middle East. The question is really, has the Biden administration found the leverage it needs to ultimately help Israel? I would suggest a nuanced change in approach, that rather than telling Prime Minister Netanyahu essentially to back off, he really needs to say, you're just not winning, and what we want you to win. And everybody is on board with you succeeding against Hamas, but you need to fight a counterinsurgency campaign. That means you support the civilian population. You don't persecute them. You you do the maximum you can to surge humanitarian aid. You do everything you can to limit civilian casualties. And from the very beginning, you have to have a political endgame that not only Israelis, but Palestinians as well can believe in. You have to have people buy into that future, or else you'll lose everyone in the process. It's
probably worth reminding people here that you are speaking, among other things, on the basis of personal experience as a former Marine who served in Iraq. So I just want to...
It's important because for all the problems with the Iraq war, and I was a quite vocal critic of the Iraq war at various times, but for all the challenges, the political solution, the political endgame was very clear. We wanted the people of Iraq to democratically elect a government. And we all knew that that's the future we were fighting for. It was something that Iraqis could ultimately buy into. And that's how we ultimately, through a lot of mistakes along the way, got to a point where that's exactly what the Iraqis got. And Iraq is it's not perfect, but it's relatively peaceful and democratic today.
Back to House Speaker Mike Johnson for a moment. He has said that he wants to invite Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, to address Congress. He said he was open to having him only address the House. Now it sounds like Chuck Schumer is open to it being a joint address, and like the Biden administration would be looped in. What do you make of this move?
Well, I think the Speaker Johnson is once again playing politics with Israel, and he's trying to set up this partisan issue between Republicans who are unequivocally supporting Prime Minister Netanyahu and Democrats who, at least in my case, are trying to really fundamentally support the state of Israel and what the goals are for peace in the Middle East, even when Prime Minister Netanyahu makes those goals harder to achieve. So if you really want Israel to succeed in this conflict, you have to understand that they need to change their strategy, and simply doing everything you can do to double down on support for Prime Minister Netanyahu is not ultimately going to be in Israel's interest. So look, I'm completely supportive of having foreign leaders come and speak before the Congress, but this is more complicated right now. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, a historically unpopular prime minister who is facing, whether it's imminent or sometime in the near future, we don't know, but is facing a vote to kick him out of that seat and get a new government. I just don't know that the timing is right to have him come to Congress. If he comes, I'll listen to what he has to say, of course.
I want to shift gears radically here and get you to talk a little bit about a bill that you filed that would transform America's rail network if it, in fact, were to pass. The American High-Speed Rail Act, it would pump more than $200 billion, I think I've got that right, into a national high-speed rail network, create, you say, 2.6 million jobs. If this bill were to pass, how much quicker would rail travel become?
You'd be able to get from Boston to Washington in 3 hours, from Boston to Chicago in 4 hours. Never a weather delay. Trains always on time. High-speed trains in Spain give you your money back if the train is 5 or 10 minutes late. Imagine that from any U.S. airline or, frankly, from Amtrak today. So it would be entirely transformative. There would be a train every 10 or 15 minutes to New York and Washington because there would be no more flights. There would be no market for flights. The choice is between spacious seats on a high-speed rail train that gets you downtown to downtown faster than you can fly, or being stuck in a pressurized aluminum tube 35,000 feet in the air, praying that the door doesn't blow out. The problem is, in America, we don't have that freedom of choice. The rest of the world, you can make that choice between flying or taking high-speed rail. We don't have a single high-speed rail line in America. This bill would be a down payment on actually creating a national network.
You know, I was laughing about praying that the door, your line about praying that the door doesn't blow out. It is, of course, completely unfunny. I shouldn't even have chuckled.
Well, look,
I mean, it's absurd.
It's sadly true.
It's absurd.
It is sadly true. That is the reality that we face flying in America today.
Is there any Republican support for your legislation? Because my sense is that Republicans tend to see train travel as something that's unsettlingly European, maybe vaguely socialistic. I don't know if I'm right about that, but is there bipartisan support of the potential for it?
The Republican opposition, as you described, is hard to pin down and really strange, frankly. High-speed rail is also just a better return on investment. So if you're a fiscal conservative, like many Republicans claim to be, you should want to put money into high-speed rail, not into airports or highways. So what that means is that there is a lot of Republican support behind the scenes. And I sense that growing, but in a formal sense, we don't yet have a Republican co-sponsor of the bill. That's, of course, something I'll be working hard on in the coming weeks and months.
Recently, we heard from your colleague, Ayanna Pressley, about her opposition to a bill that passed the House by a big bipartisan margin that would ban TikTok if it is not spun off into a separate autonomous company. Let's take a look at how Representative Pressley explained her opposition to that bill.
I voted no because although I certainly agree that we need to take immediate action to enact greater oversight over big tech and social media, but we need something more comprehensive. We should not be targeting TikTok. I think the bill that came before the House is really the wrong approach. I do have concerns around privacy. I have concerns about data harvesting, but those concerns are not unique to TikTok.
You voted for the ban or the proposed ban. Why?
First of all, it's not a ban. It just says that we need to, the Chinese owners, which essentially is the Chinese Communist Party, needs to divest of TikTok.
But if they didn't, there'd be
a foreign company.
Right.
And let's be clear, this is not, it was inaccurate for her to say that this is only targeting TikTok. That's not what the legislation says. The legislation does apply to TikTok, but it sets out rules that will apply to any social media company owned by a foreign adversary. Look, if CNN or WGBH was owned by the Soviet Union in the heart of the Cold War, we wouldn't say that that's a good idea. And CNN and WGBH don't influence our kids, our children, nearly to the extent that TikTok does. So there are real serious dangers. Some of them Representative Pressley acknowledged, but there's no other means to deal with this than supporting this bill. So I'm very proud to support it. No piece of legislation is perfect, but this is a huge step in the right direction. And at the end of the day, I think users are going to find that TikTok gets better. Why? Because once it's sold, or maybe there's a new TikTok in its place. The feeds that people get in their phones will actually be influenced more by TikTok users than by the Chinese Communist Party. That'll be a good thing for America. That'll be a good thing for our kids. Ultimately, it will be a good thing for this social media.
Before we wrap up, and you'll have about a minute to answer this question, but you've been pushing for years to elect more veterans to Congress. You've set up a PAC for that purpose, the Serve America PAC. How active is that PAC, and how active are you going to be in this upcoming election cycle?
Well, I'll tell you what, if you came to our kickoff in Boston a few weeks ago, you would have found it the most active, excited, and positive political room in America today. It was an incredibly diverse crowd, young, energetic, but also some old hands in politics. We had a number of elected officials there, all people who say we need to hold the line on democracy in the face of a possible Trump presidency. That means winning back the House. That means an end to this Republican dysfunction. And we're going to do it through some amazing leaders who know what it means to serve the country. They've already proven that. And they're running in some of the toughest races, the critical races in America that we need to bring into Democratic hands. So I'm excited. There are a lot of people excited about this effort. It's a way to win the House. It's a way to help hold on to the Senate. And ultimately, it's a way to just get better leadership, better, more principled leadership into politics. God knows, we all know that we need that in America today.
All right, Congressman Seth Moulton, thank you very much for taking time to talk with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam.